Hello, everyone. Welcome to the morning show on Channel 9. We're also live streaming on Port Media's YouTube channel. And if you prefer to watch that way, it's easy to find. Just go to www.ncmhub.org and click on the YouTube icon. I'm just delighted to welcome my guest today. I'm Mary Jacobsen, your host, by the way, and today I'm welcoming Eric Jay Dolin. He's a best-selling historian and a prolific author with a gift for choosing epic topics and really terrific titles. His history of lighthouses was called Brilliant Beacons. He wrote a history of the fur trade called Fur Fortunes and Empire. He also wrote Leviathan, a history of whaling. Last year, he was kind enough to visit the morning show to talk about his book, also with a great title, Black Flags, Blue Waters, a history of pirates, which will, by the way, forever dispel any romanticized notions that you have about pirates. So I've been looking forward to talking to him about his newest book, A Furious Sky, since he mentioned to me at the end of last year's interview that he was working on a 500-year history of hurricanes in America. Eric and I were just talking. We knew it would be hurricane season when he came on the show, but I don't think we could have predicted we'd be talking about hurricanes while Hurricane Laura was busy devastating Louisiana and parts of Texas. So Eric, hello and welcome. Thank you so much for visiting the morning show to talk about hurricanes.
Hello, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Well, Eric, I wanted to start out, you've written books on everything from lighthouses to whales to the fur trade and of course to pirates. And I remember when we were talking about your book about pirates and what attracted you to that subject, you mentioned that you were eager to find a subject that might attract your children to finally read one of your books. And I think you told me that that was successful, that they did read your book about
Yeah.
pirates. So I wanted to find out what drew you to the subject of hurricanes.
Yeah. Actually, yeah, most of the books that I've written, and this is my 14th book, are topics that come to me because I'm interested in them, or I read something about them in my last book I worked on. But Furious Sky was a little bit different. I had long been fascinated by hurricanes, but I didn't know a lot about them. And I thought that it would be great to write a book about a single hurricane. But the problem was the two hurricanes that became my prime candidates for book topics were the Galveston hurricane of 1900 and the Great Hurricane of 1938, which plowed into New England, as many of your listeners probably and viewers probably know. There was an issue, though, with both of those hurricanes. They both had excellent books written
Oh.
about them. And I didn't feel like I wanted to write another book length treatment of either of those hurricanes and just add yet another book to the literature. So I put aside the idea of hurricanes. And actually, at that point, I went on to write Black Flags, Blue Waters about pirates. And I pretty much had forgotten about hurricanes. But then we had the hurricane season from hell, the 2017 hurricane season, when hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria and Irma blew into the country, caused damages totaling $265 billion, transfixed the nation for the better part of a month with amazing news coverage of the devastation. And right after that hurricane season, my editor at LiveWrite, which is my publisher, part of W.W. Norton, the editor and the head sales director, thought, there should be a good book on the history of America's hurricanes. And they immediately thought of me as a potential person to write it because a lot of my books span multiple centuries. I use specific topics as a narrative backbone to tell a broader story of American history. So they reached out to my literary agent, and he in turn sent an email to me saying, "Hey, are you interested in writing a book about the history of America's hurricanes?" So I was excited to get that prompt because I was in the midst of trying to figure out what my next book idea was going to be. But I didn't say yes right away because these books take me the better part of 2 years to research and write. And I want to make sure that I pick a topic that's going to keep me engaged and not bore me to tears. And I also have to pick a topic that I know there's a good book there. So I still didn't know a lot about hurricanes, even though I knew something about the hurricane in 1938. I knew very little about hurricanes in general. So I went off for about a month and a half, went to the local libraries, hopped online, and I read a bunch of books and articles and interviews, and I watched documentaries about
Mm.
hurricanes. And after that time, I convinced myself that I could see the outlines of an entire book. And I said, sure, I'll write the book. It wasn't as simple as that. I had to then write a proposal, which is basically
Yeah.
an annotated
Yeah.
outline of the book. And I had to submit it to my publisher and they had to agree. But the fact that they're the ones that came to me with the idea meant that it was pretty much of a shoo-in unless I really screwed
Right.
up
Yeah.
the proposal.
Yeah. So the
But
breadcrumbs were there
yeah,
from your
breadcrumbs.
initial idea, and the interest was there.
Yeah,
So, that's an interesting story. Well, I'm glad you wrote it because it is comprehensive, meticulously researched, and has so many excellent and amazing stories in it. Eric. So it does seem to be a convergence of, I mean, being invited to write a book about which you already had an interest seems like a good story, a
yeah,
good outcome.
yes,
Well, I wanted in the beginning of your book, you start out wanting to define your subject, of course, a good place to begin. But you comment that answering the question, "What is a hurricane?" is actually a surprisingly complicated, complex endeavor. So I wanted to start out by asking you, why is that so? And taking those complexities into consideration, how do you define a hurricane?
yeah. One of the things that writing this book did for me is it gave me a lot more, excuse me, a lot more sort of respect for meteorologists. I always respected them, weather reporters, but I didn't know a lot about what they do. But when I started to get into the details about meteorology and the evolution of our understanding of hurricanes, it's incredibly complex. And
Mm,
I just want to make it clear that my book is designed for the general
mhm.
reader. Although it has quite a bit of science in it, I try to present it in a relatively simple way because the nuts and bolts of meteorology, of understanding the physics of hurricane formation and computer modeling, the really understanding it and going into it at a high level are beyond my capacity. Essentially, it's very,
And
it's very,
mine,
very,
and most general readers.
yeah, it's very complex. But simply stated, I mean, a hurricane is a vast, swirling storm with sustained winds of at least 74 miles per hour, and it goes up from there. And there are two other ingredients that are necessary to have a hurricane form. One is you need to have well, actually, three ingredients. One is you need to have warm ocean temperatures
Mm,
down to about 150 feet of at least 80 degrees
mm,
Fahrenheit. And that creates the energy, the heat energy that
mm,
fuels the storm. Two other ingredients are you have to have a lack of wind shear. You don't want winds at different heights going in different directions
mm,
because that'll rip apart the hurricane. So you want a favorable environment where there's a uniform distribution of winds essentially up and down. And then you need an abundance of moist, warm air
mm,
rising from the ocean's surface. And as that moist air rises, the moisture it cools and it condenses to form clouds.
mm,
But one of the fascinating things is when you condense moisture or water vapor, excuse me, to form clouds, it releases something called the latent heat of
mm,
condensation. And that's a lot of heat. And that heat
mm,
helps to power the storm. So that it gives the
mm.
fuel to keep it going. Another element of a hurricane that people are always fascinated by, and which is not well understood, is the eye. In the center of a
Yeah.
hurricane, a well-formed hurricane, there is the eye, which is where the winds die down, and often you can see the sky and it feels like the hurricane has passed by, but you're actually just in the center of this eye, which can be anywhere from 10 to 40 or 50 miles wide, depending on the size of the hurricane. And believe it or not, meteorologists and scientists don't completely understand why the eye forms. It has something to do with the warm, moist air is rising, creating an area of low pressure. And then at the top of the hurricane, cold air is going into the center and is
Huh.
descending. And that cold air and the warm air sort of hit each other and cancel each other out to some extent.
Oh,
And that's what
okay.
keeps the winds down. And also the Coriolis effect and the spinning nature of the earth and how that deflects the winds that are rushing in to the low pressure area to the right creates this sort of swirl. So it's not really centripetal force, but it's a number of elements that go into forming this amazing feature of every hurricane that you can see from a satellite and you can also see on ground. And it's created problems for people, especially many years ago when they didn't understand hurricanes as well as we do now. A lot of people who would be in the middle of a hurricane and the winds are whipping and everything's flying all over the place. And then all of a sudden the winds die down and they see the sun streaking through. Many people felt that that's the end of the hurricane, and they would leave their places where they were hiding and they'd think it was all over. And then they'd get caught again when the other side of the hurricane passed by and suddenly they were in the eye wall of the hurricane, but just on the opposite side. And the eye wall is the part of the hurricane right outside of the eye where you tend to get the most ferocious, violent winds. So anyway, just
So that would be scary.
that was
In
very
fact, instead of the hurricane being over, as you might be tempted to think, were you in that calm center, you're
yeah.
actually about to be hit by the fiercest part of it. Um, gosh, well, anyway, thank you for that because that's one of the things I wanted to ask you about because it's such a distinct phenomenon when you see the aerial views, as we've all just been seeing on TV of Laura. You see the kind of cloud cover and the swirling, and then right in the middle you see it looks like an iris.
Yeah.
There's a reason they call it an eye.
And
And I'm reassured to find out nobody entirely understands why, although you've given you've given a good description of the what is going on. And I
yeah,
think, Eric, I was also interested that there's a difference in the northern and southern hemisphere, I think, of the
right,
directionality of that.
right.
Um, Now, I'm not sure. Is it clockwise in the northern hemisphere
No,
or
it's
count? It's
counterclockwise. It's
counterclockwise.
like this in the
Yeah.
northern hemisphere and clockwise in the southern hemisphere. It's the same thing. It's a hurricane, and that has to do with the Coriolis effect. That was something that was discussed in the early 1800s and then applied to meteorology in the later 1800s. And essentially, what it does in the northern hemisphere is you've got this central eye of the hurricane, which is low pressure, and there's air ascending. And as everybody has heard, nature abhors a vacuum. Well, a low pressure
Yeah.
area is not actually a vacuum, but when you have low pressure area, higher pressure areas out beyond the hurricane or on the side of the hurricane, the wind wants to
Mm,
rush into the center
okay.
to fill that area of low pressure. But as the winds are rushing into the center, they get deflected slightly to the right by the Coriolis effect, the spinning of the earth
Yeah.
and the conservation of angular momentum and a lot of stuff that I just don't fundamentally understand. And that was one of the challenges of the book. I think I did a
Uh-huh.
good job. I had two professional meteorologists review my manuscript to make sure that I got the science right, and I was happy that I did. But just like any topic, if you dig deep enough, there are experts in it who know details that an average person,
Yeah.
you have to go to school to really understand.
Right, right. No, but the complexity we were talking about of the definition is becoming clear as you talk because there are
Yeah,
layers and layers.
yeah,
So, wow, that's really interesting, Eric. One of the things I wanted to ask you about was, there is a distinct season to hurricanes, and so
yeah,
we can kind of know. Between end of June, beginning of November, that's when, if there's going to be a hurricane, that's when it's going to happen, which is good. It's reassuring
yeah.
to know there are limits. It's not an entire
Yeah.
year phenomenon. But beyond that, as you say in your book, if you live on the East Coast, the Gulf Coast, or the Caribbean, um, I'm quoting you now, hurricanes are
Yeah,
looming threats that might invade your lives, and there's
right.
nothing you can do to prevent their strike. That's the scary part.
Yeah, yeah,
But I'm wondering, to what extent can we calculate the odds even a little, and how many hurricanes do take place roughly each year? How
right,
many of them are whoppers, and
right.
what states are most likely to get whopped, so to speak?
Yeah. In an average year, there are six
Mm,
hurricanes that dance across the Atlantic or come up through the Gulf of Mexico, three of which are major, which means
mm,
sustained winds of at least 111 miles per hour. But
Wow.
fortunately for us, only a small number of those hurricanes hit land, make landfall. And
Yeah.
landfall is essentially defined as when the eye of the storm intersects with land or the
Mm.
coast. So it has to be the eye of the storm. Um, so we have those 6 hurricanes, 3 of which are major, but in an average year, we only get 2 landfalling hurricanes, and a major one with winds of 111 miles per hour or more only hits us about one every 2 years. But
Mm.
as people listening to this and watching this will know, the hurricane season for 2020, even from the outset back many months ago, was predicted to be much higher than normal. And
Yeah.
recently, a couple of weeks ago, the predictions and the forecasts were even made more scary.
Mm.
In a normal year, we're supposed to get 12 named storms, which are tropical storms and hurricanes. We've already had 14 named storms this season, and we're just
Wow.
entering the peak period. So this season is breaking all sorts of records. There's estimated to be anywhere between 19 and I think 25 named storms. There might be 6 to 9 hurricanes. 3 of them or more might be major. And again, you have to keep in mind that's a forecast. That's a
Yeah.
prediction based on a lot of factors, historical factors as well as on the ground factors. But there are a number of ingredients, including very warm ocean waters,
Mm.
the development of a La Nina in the Pacific, which
Mm.
tends to reduce wind shear in the Atlantic, very favorable monsoons and storm uh, over Africa, and a lot of other things that are seemingly going to contribute to a very active, they already have contributed to a very active tropical cyclone season. Whether at the end of November we look back and say that this season has been one for the history books, maybe we have 3 or 4 hurricanes that make landfall, a couple of major ones. I don't know. It doesn't look good right now.
Yeah.
And September is really the month where we're going to find out.
Yeah.
But there have been big hurricanes in the end of October and even into November. So
Yeah.
as the world warms up, the extent of hurricane season, you know, we might see strong hurricanes later and later into the season.
Yeah. Well, that's sobering.
Yeah,
Because even if there aren't as many as the most dire forecasts, it still sounds like it's very likely that there will be more than normal.
yeah,
So because the supposition is it's just forecast, but it's so much bigger than what a normal season would be. So watch out, everybody.
right.
So, well, you've got some great descriptions of hurricanes, and the one I loved was you talk about hurricanes coursing through the centuries like brawlers, bobbing and weaving and slugging anyone that stands in their way. And you'd say that they've left an indelible mark on American history. So I was hoping, Eric, that you could give us some examples of how American history has been indelibly marked by hurricanes.
Sure. One early example is in the late 1550s, the Spanish, who had been colonizing the Western Hemisphere, they decided they wanted to colonize the area of Pensacola, Florida, and they sent 11 ships there with many soldiers and many settlers to make a beachhead in the North American continent. They didn't last very long because soon after they landed, a major hurricane roared in,
Wow.
sunk most of the ships, destroyed a lot of their food, killed many people. There were rescue fleets or sort of resupply fleets that were sent from Mexico in subsequent weeks and months. But this little colony, the Luna colony, just couldn't manage to hang on and basically disappeared within a year's time. Now,
Yeah.
just think, the way you have to think about history changing is think about what would have happened if that hurricane never struck.
Mm.
And instead of having most of their ships sunk, many people killed, and all their food ruined, they would have been in a very good position to have established a thriving colony and give it a year or two to make a foothold on the continent. And then they might have started spreading north, east, and west throughout what is now the United States much earlier. And the future of the United States might have been quite different. Then just a few years later, on the east coast of Florida, the French and the Spanish were both trying to get a foothold. And a French fleet launched itself against the Spanish fleet near St. Augustine and St. Augustine and down towards Cape Canaveral. And what happened is right at the point when the French fleet, a very powerful fleet, many ships, 400 soldiers and Marines, was about ready to attack the Spanish fleet, a hurricane came by
Wow.
and destroyed more than half of the French fleet. And then the Spanish, who had the upper hand because they weren't at sea at the time, they were on land, they went and they hunted the French and
Mm.
killed hundreds of them,
Wow.
slaughtered them. And that's why Florida in the 1560s essentially became a Spanish colony until the mid 1700s. But just imagine if that hurricane hadn't struck and the French had defeated the Spanish, then back in the 16th century, Florida would have been a French colony. And the
Wow.
future of America might have been quite different. Another great story involves something that's more familiar to us, which is the American Revolution. In 1780, there were two massive hurricanes that struck the Caribbean, killing 22,000 people. But more importantly, they destroyed numerous British and French ships and killed many, many soldiers. And as a result of that, the French, who were now allies with the American colonists in their fight against the British, they decided that they didn't want to stay in the Caribbean the next hurricane season. It was just too dangerous. So they spent the winter of 1780 and 81 mending their boats and recollecting their strength. And then in the summer of 1781, they sailed north. And ultimately, in October, as we all learn in high school or college or maybe even before, the French fleet helped
Mm.
General George Washington at Yorktown
Hmm.
essentially defeat the British and Lord Cornwallis because the French fleet got involved in something called the Battle of the Chesapeake or the Battle of the Capes, and they fended off a powerful British fleet that was coming down to resupply and support Lord Cornwallis. But they couldn't make it there because the French fleet were in their way. And the reason the French fleet was up in that part of the world had something to do with their fear of hurricanes and getting
Right.
out of the Caribbean in time. So the surrender of the British to George Washington on October 19th, 1781, at the end of the Battle of Yorktown, really was a turning point in the war. It didn't end the war. People often think it ended the war, but there were
Mm.
still many battles,
Mm.
especially at sea, to take place. But it was a turning point because soon thereafter they started to discuss peace negotiations, and we finally got the peace in 1783. So just think of it. These hurricanes are massive forces. It's not surprising that if they hit at the right time, they can affect, uh, large scale historical events.
Yeah.
But another way to look at it that I don't really write about in the book, but should become clear in the book, is that every hurricane that makes landfall has a fundamental and lasting impact on the
Mm.
communities that it hits. So, people who live through a hurricane like Katrina or Andrew or Sandy, they often talk about their life before Katrina and after Katrina, before Andrew and after Andrew, before the hurricane of 1938
Yeah.
and after the hurricane of 1938. And these storms, which cause multiple billions, sometimes tens and hundreds of billions of dollars worth of damage, they create an irreparable, in some sense, scar on the history of that region or that area. And if you could somehow accumulate economically, and I'll leave this to an economics student or professor, but if you could look at each individual hurricane that has made landfall in the United States and calculate the economic impact to that area, and then see how that economic impact rippled out to the broader country, because many of us, we pay taxes. A lot of those taxes, $100 billion worth of our taxes essentially went to help people in after Katrina in Louisiana and Mississippi. So if you could somehow collate all of the economic, financial, emotional, physical scars that come from individual hurricanes and accumulate them over time, you would definitely see that hurricanes have had a major impact on our entire country's history. And how could they not? They're just the
Yeah.
world's greatest, most vicious storms. I'm not trying to downplay tornadoes. Tornadoes are very scary.
Right.
They often have winds that are great in excess of a hurricane, but you can't really compare them because a tornado is relatively brief. It usually impacts
Mhm.
a relatively small area. It is absolutely horrific for the people that are in its way, and it can kill numerous people. But hurricanes can be up to 1,000 miles in diameter,
Yeah.
and they last for a long time. They sort
Yeah.
of, and it's just a totally different scale of devastation.
Those are just fascinating examples, Eric. Thank you for those. The impact, in other words, is almost unfathomable
Yeah,
in its scale. And for example, we could be speaking French or Spanish right now, were it not for the timing of certain hurricanes. But also, what I take from what you're saying is that if you're living your life and there are different potential futures that you're anticipating and
yeah,
expecting will play out, a hurricane comes along and it's everything is up for grabs, and so they kind of shape the future. There's
yeah,
a certain destiny shaping quality to these massive storms, which is just fascinating to contemplate. It's actually not anything
yeah,
I'd ever thought about before until I read
yeah,
your book. So thanks for that. It makes one
sure.
feel the sense of fragility, I guess, or that we're not in control, I guess is one way to put it, that there are
Well,
other forces at work.
listening to you makes me think it's like those books my kids used to read. I never read them as a kid. You know those books where you can pick your own ending? You can
Oh, yeah.
have different plots that'll take
Yeah,
you.
that's right.
It's really true
Right,
about history. Just think about
right,
if certain individuals who had great impacts on history, if they had been killed, history would have gone in a different direction.
right.
A good example with hurricanes is somebody that a lot of people in New England know about is Cotton Mather, the famous Puritan preacher.
Yeah.
His grandfather was on a boat off of Cape Ann in 1635, coming to the New World to be a minister when the hurricane of 1635 struck.
Ah,
And his boat made it through. And as a result, he had a son named Increase Mather, who had a son named Cotton Mather. But
mhm,
another boat very nearby didn't make it through that
mm,
hurricane, and most people on board were killed. So just think, I mean, Cotton Mather looms pretty large in the history
yeah,
of colonial America. Just
yeah,
imagine how things might have been different
right,
had he never been born. And that's just
right,
one person.
right, right. Fascinating. One of the things I wanted to also ask you about, because I learned this from your book and didn't realize it before, is, like most people, I think, who are not knowledgeable about the subject, I didn't realize that most of the hurricanes in the North Atlantic don't originate over the water.
Right.
But strangely, or at least it seems strange until I read about it in your book, they begin in the southern flanks of the Saharan Desert.
Right.
So, would you explain how this kind of planetary migration of heat and dust
Right.
winds up creating what you call, again, a great phrase, a temper tantrum on steroids
Right.
as it gets to the Cape Verdean Islands?
Right. Over the Sahara Desert, obviously, very hot air. That hot air mixes with warm, moist air winging in off the Indian Ocean and coming up from the south off the Guinea coast. And this creates areas of low pressure and thunderstorm activity, believe it or not, storm activity over the Sahara. These waves of instability move towards the west. They're
Mm,
called African easterly waves because they
mm,
come from the east and they move
yeah.
to the west. And every few days during hurricane season, or these waves come off the edge, the tip of Africa, and then they tend to head over the Cape Verde Islands. Now, fortunately for us, most of those waves sort of dissolve, break apart, and do no more harm. But every fourth or fifth wave sort of organizes itself into a circular storm. And if it's got winds, an organized circulation of up to 38 miles an hour, it's called a tropical depression and has no
Mm,
name. But a small percentage of those become tropical storms with winds of 39 miles per hour to 73 miles per hour. And then they're looking more like a hurricane. And only a small percentage of all of these African easterly waves that come off Africa make it up the evolutionary ladder from
mm,
depression to tropical storm to hurricane. But about 60 to 70% of all the hurricanes that affect us in the North Atlantic and in the Caribbean originate over the Cape Verde Islands and ultimately over the Sahara is where they're born. But there are other hurricanes that come up from the Gulf of Mexico and other ones that just sort of start in the Atlantic Ocean. But that's why a lot of hurricanes are called Cape Verde type
Yeah.
hurricanes. They sweep across the Atlantic and then sometimes go into the Gulf. Sometimes they go up the coast along the East Coast. And 85% of our major hurricanes, however, tend to be these Cape Verde type hurricanes. So it is fascinating. You
Yeah.
mentioned dust. Dust is actually an inhibiting factor oftentimes because dust implies dry air. Dry air is a
Uh,
killer of hurricanes. And so earlier this season, we had some tropical storms or depressions that looked scary, but then they got into an unfavorable environment over the Atlantic
hmm.
where they ran into a bunch of dry air. And just like if they ran into a lot of wind shear, they might be torn apart. So now we're sort of a little bit beyond the season where we have major interference from Saharan dust storms. So the environment is even more conducive right now to hurricane formation. But I don't want to scare everybody. I mean, it may turn out that Hurricane Laura may be our last big hurricane of the season.
Well,
You don't know.
it's that you underscore the unpredictability of it, which is something we just have to live with. But I just was struck by the interdependence of each part of the planet on other parts of the planet for something as impactful on our lives as a hurricane. So, I was also interested to learn that as scary and dangerous as high-speed winds are, it's actually the destructive power of water with hurricanes that you really have to beware of. So help us understand why it is that emergency managers say of hurricanes, and I'm quoting your book now, that they say hide from the wind, but run from the water.
Yeah, well, a cubic yard of water weighs 1,700 pounds. And
Massive.
about 80 to 90% of all deaths and all fatalities during hurricanes are the result of water. And that's either storm surge coming from the ocean or flooding coming from rivers or just rain. Uh, and you can hide from the wind to some extent, although if it's a very powerful hurricane, it's going to blow apart houses as well. But just the statistics bear out the fact that water is the more deadly killer during hurricanes. And that's why this Hurricane Laura, that is still now, I guess it's in Louisiana and moving up towards Arkansas, it's still a hurricane. But the big concern was the storm surge. They were talking about unsurvivable storm surge
Yeah.
of up to 20 feet. I only got to watch the news a little bit before I hopped on with you. And what I understand is that the storm surge was not nearly as bad as was predicted. It may have been as high as 11 feet someplace, which is very impressive and causes a lot of devastation. And I think we'll see that in the coming days. But this raises another troubling issue with hurricanes. People, first of all, a lot of people don't pay attention to evacuation orders to begin with, which is problematic. A lot of people hold it against politicians if they ask you to evacuate, but then the storm is not as bad as predicted,
Yeah.
and they're less likely to listen the next time around. And I fear, and again, I have to watch more of the coverage, but I fear that because the warnings in advance of Hurricane Laura were so dire with respect to storm surge being up to 20 feet high, which is historic levels. And the fact that it didn't make it, I guarantee you're going to see some news stories where people say, yeah, they just hyped it up. The National Hurricane Center, which used that term, and the Weather Channel and all these forecasters, they got us all hyped up and worried for no reason. And those people who stayed behind, even though there were mandatory evacuations, and they survived, they're going to say, hey, you guys are the losers. You left, we stayed behind. It wasn't a big deal. And you see that over and over again in the history of hurricanes. And I just wish that people were more sensible, more rational, and understanding that we're only human and we're doing the best we can.
Right.
It's better safe than sorry.
Right. Absolutely.
But anyway, we'll see if that plays out over the next couple of days.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, you'd much rather have the outcome of having a storm be not as dire as the meteorologists think, and they're basing that on their forecasting models, doing the best they can. I would much rather have that outcome than be somebody who was, as you're saying, the danger of becoming skeptical and staying behind, and then the unsurvivable 20-foot storm surge does come, which could easily be. So, yeah, human nature, big question mark there.
Yeah.
So, well, along those lines, Eric, I wanted to ask you, why do you think that we as a species are so fascinated with horrible weather? I mean, because we watch it on TV. Each big storm, there are scenes of cars on top of houses or flooded
Right.
streets, main streets with people in boats, people waiting to be rescued on top of the roofs of their houses, howling winds and tsunami high waves, and they're always um, impressive scenes of devastation, although they're quite similar, you know, with each storm. But the news will feature this type of footage for days, in anticipation of the storm, during the storm, and then after the storm. Why do you think that we are kind of obsessed with scenes of weather devastation?
Well, I think you have to look at it from a broader perspective. Human beings, why do people rubberneck on the highway when there's a
Mm.
crash? Why do our nightly news reports, despite the fact that there's so much bad news, but they talk about these horrific things and you almost can't keep your eyes off the report because it's human drama. And there's something in human nature that you focus on these larger than life and sometimes death inducing events, and hurricanes are simply the greatest storms on earth. They're the number one, I think, reality show, to use that word broadly, that we have. And just think about, Laura, think about, we have experience in the last couple of days. Look at the news coverage. It was ominous. It caught your attention.
Yeah,
You were worrying about if you're a good person, you're worrying about what was
yeah,
going to happen to people in the face of
yeah,
the storm. And then we're all eager to see what happened in the aftermath. So devastation, horrific events, they have a magnetic pull over us, because maybe some of us are vicariously thinking, there, but for the grace of God, go out. I mean, what would
yeah,
happen if I was in that situation?
right,
And you really have empathy towards those people.
yeah.
And and other parts of it are, why, if I knew the answer to why people love reading murder mysteries, which is about murdering,
Yeah.
or why people love to watch movies where they're just gory decapitations and all this stuff. But it's fascinating. But if I could truly give you an answer as to why humans are so fascinated by things that, if you take a look at them objectively, are horrific.
Yeah.
I set up shop. I put out a shingle. I make a lot of money.
Well, it could be your next book, your next book topic, Eric. Well, you talk about in the book that, in fact, as we were just saying, that hurricanes combine scenes of epic devastation, but there are also then, in tandem with that, stories of epic heroism. And I
Yeah.
was hoping that maybe you might share one of your favorite stories of epic heroism that you encountered in writing your book.
Sure. No, that is true. Sometimes often see the best in people under duress and horrific situations. I'll tell you two quick stories. One starts off the book and has permanent relevance today, because Hurricane Audrey in June of 1957, a Category 3 hurricane, essentially Category 4 right before it hit, um, hit the same area of Louisiana that's being pummeled today, Cameron Parish and
Mm.
the surrounding Lake Charles, and caused devastation, killed hundreds and hundreds of people, and basically wiped much of that town off the map. But there was a doctor there, Dr. Clark, who had a local clinic, and he wanted to get to his clinic when the storm rolled in to help his patients. He ultimately wasn't able to get to his clinic. He was driving his car there. He had to turn around. He got swept off the road, and he had
Mm.
to shelter in place with another family while his wife and their maid, live-in maid, and three of his five children were back home a few miles to the east. Well, during the height of the hurricane, unbeknownst to him, his three kids and the maid were killed. His wife actually
Oh.
survived. But when he came out, as the hurricane passed by, he came out of this house he was sheltering in, and he wanted to go back home to find out what happened to his family. But the people there knew who he was. He was a famous local doctor. He had great practice, and they begged him to go to the courthouse to treat all the injured people
Oh.
from the hurricane. And taking his Hippocratic oath, or taking his oath to medicine and to heal and to help people who are under his care, he disregarded his personal need to find out what happened to his family, and he went and tended to the sick, and he did that for quite some time. And it was only later, almost a day later, that he found out that his wife had survived and two of his other kids had
Wow.
survived in another part of Louisiana. And he won all sorts of awards for this, for his heroism, his
Yeah.
dedication to his people. And he basically said, I was just doing what I had to do.
Yeah.
And he was a real hero in my eyes.
Yeah.
Another person I think is very heroic is Clara Barton of the Red Cross
Mm.
during the Sea Islands hurricane of 1893. It struck the Sea Islands off of South Carolina particularly hard, especially the Gullah culture, which were
Mm.
people who were descended from African slaves who had worked in the South and were still doing agricultural work. Maybe 2,000 people on the Sea Islands died during this hurricane. And this was before we had a dedicated machinery to help people in the aftermath of
Mm.
a hurricane. So Clara Barton, who had only started up, the angel of the battlefield during
Yeah.
Civil War, she was the head of the American Red Cross, and she had already done some yeoman service at the Johnstown flood. So she descended on the Sea Islands and basically set up a system with many of her volunteers and with donations to help the people there get up off the ground, pull themselves together, and start planning and acting for the future. And I think that was quite heroic. There are other stories in the book.
Yeah.
The Cajun Navy, the volunteers from Louisiana who, after Hurricane Katrina, came with their boats to New Orleans and saved 10,000 people, or ferried 10,000 people to safety from their flooded homes. There are other stories in there, and I think
Yeah.
that's one of the positive takeaway lessons from the
Yeah.
history of hurricanes, that when people are put in dire situations, often their best shines
Yeah.
through. Is a
Yeah.
phrase that my dad used to tell me all the
Yeah.
time. I don't know where it comes from, but is adversity introduces a man or a woman to themselves.
Right.
And some people step up
Yeah.
and some people don't.
But it's always inspiring to hear the stories of the people who step up, and one always hopes that one would be among those, but never can be
Yeah,
quite sure. So,
yeah,
Eric, I also did want to find out a little bit from you about the phenomenon of naming hurricanes. Why
yeah.
did people start naming hurricanes? Why did they name them after women initially? And how did the women's movement wind up changing it so that now they have alternating male and female names?
Well, I'll tell you a story. It's a long story, but it's a great story. One of the ones that I liked writing about the most. But to tell you the quick story, there was a guy named Clement Raggy in Australia that started naming in the late 1800s, early 1900s, cyclones down there, or willy willies as they were called, which were just hurricanes by another name. He started naming them in tropical storms after Tahitian women, like uh,
Oh,
like
uh-huh.
Melina, a
Yeah.
dusky maiden, and he got in trouble for that. But in 1941, there was a famous novelist, George Rippey Stewart, who wrote a book called Storm. He had read about Clement Raggy in this book, which is about a storm in the Pacific, not a hurricane. He had the meteorologist in the book name the storm Mariah. He named each storm
Ah,
after a woman. That book became extremely popular. It was a bestseller, and it was sent to GIs in the Pacific Theater. So in
huh.
the mid 1940s in the Pacific, the Navy and the Army started just their own system of naming typhoons, which are hurricanes by another name, after women.
Huh.
And then we go to the early 1950s when the Weather Bureau, the precursor of the National Weather Service, wanted to start naming hurricanes to give them some personality and allow people to keep better track of them. And they decided, largely because of George Rippey Stewart and Clement Raggy and the history of naming hurricanes after women, that they do it as well. And there was some pushback. One woman said, I'd rather have an unnamed hurricane hit my house than a hurricane named after one of my husband's former girlfriends. But the Weather Bureau stuck with it. And in 1956, they started naming hurricanes after women. But then comes along the women's movement, and
Yeah.
in particular, a woman named Roxy Bolton, who was a vice president of NOW, National Organization of Women. And she said it was downright insulting to name hurricanes after women. And she was sick of reading the news coverage where hurricanes were referred to as unladylike, witches, vicious, just horrible names. And having women arbitrarily associated with disaster was not something she felt was appropriate. So she gave some alternatives. She said, why not name hurricanes after birds? or after politicians who love to have things named after them. And she even recommended that hurricanes should be called himicanes. Well, she didn't get much traction, but then Jimmy Carter becomes president. He appoints Juanita Krebs, the first female secretary of the Department of Commerce. She's a self-avowed feminist, and she latches onto this idea, and basically through her efforts, the World Meteorological Organization, which was in charge of the naming convention at that time, was convinced that we should start naming hurricanes after men and women on an alternating basis.
Mhm.
But this season might create another situation like the one that happened in 2005 when Hurricane Katrina came through, where we might run out of names. There are only 21
Mm.
names on the list. So if we get beyond 21, we're going to start naming hurricanes and tropical storms after the Greek alphabet. So that'll be interesting if we get to that. I think
Okay.
that was just one of my favorite stories in the book.
That is a great story. Thank you so much for that. I wonder if that's soon as that old song they call the wind Mariah.
Yes.
So there you go. Who knew? Well, I did want to ask you a little bit. We in some ways we've kind of indirectly touched upon the increase in the heat of the water, and that leads us to the impact of climate change. Eric, could you say just a little bit more about the anticipated impact of climate change on hurricanes?
Yeah, global warming has already had an impact on the ultimate impact of hurricanes, not the hurricanes themselves, but because of the warming of the world, there's been thermal expansion of the ocean and also the melting of the glaciers, which has led
Yeah.
to sea level rise. And here in New England, we're very familiar with that.
Yeah.
So essentially, hurricanes, storm surge creates more damage now than it would have 100 years ago. For example, if Hurricane Sandy had hit New York 100 years ago, the surface of the ocean in around New York was a foot lower than it is now. So the impact was less. But in
Yeah.
terms of going forward, there are a growing body of studies that indicate that in a warmer world, we're likely to have more intense and wetter hurricanes. There is not a 100% cause and effect relationship. Scientists would tell you there's still a lot of unknowns. Some studies indicate that we're going to have fewer hurricanes in the future, but those that we do have will be more powerful. Or
Yeah.
maybe we'll have hurricanes that linger longer, like Hurricane Harvey. So even if we have fewer hurricanes or they're not as strong, if they stick around for 40 or 50 hours in one place, we're in big trouble. So
Yeah.
although there is not 100% confidence in our predictions of what hurricanes in the future are going to look like, because there are so many factors that go into it, after reviewing the literature as I did, as a policymaker, if I was a policymaker, we often make policy based on less than 100% certainty about what's going to happen. That's just a fact of life. I think the evidence is mounting and extremely persuasive that we are likely to have more intense, wetter hurricanes in the future if heating continues to go along the path and trajectory that we're on now. So
Yeah.
I would be concerned, but
Yeah.
the thing is with global warming, and we won't get in a whole debate about global warming, if you're concerned about global warming, hurricanes is only one little part of it. There's
Right.
heat-based agricultural shifts,
Right.
there's climate refugees, there's coral
Yeah.
bleaching. I mean, there's
Right.
so many
So many.
impacts of global warming that it's a much larger issue. But I
Yeah.
think hurricanes deserve to be thrown into the mix.
Absolutely, given the power and the force of them.
Yeah.
And well, I just have a couple more questions for you, Eric. One of them is, would you, knowing what you know about hurricanes, would you ever live on the coast of Florida or Louisiana?
I'm going to give a cop-out answer because I love New England so much. I'd never leave New England no matter what.
Yeah.
But to give a more serious answer, I actually had a conversation with somebody yesterday about this, whose daughter moved to San Francisco, and we were talking the relative merits or concerns about earthquakes versus hurricanes.
Yeah.
There are risks anywhere. I mean,
Yeah.
New England is due for another big hurricane, and 5 to 10 times a century, New England gets walloped by a hurricane. And I predict that within my lifetime, as long as I live longer, there is going to be another major hurricane that hits New England.
Yeah.
And with the warming world, we may get more of them than we did in the past.
Yeah.
So I would be hesitant, just personally, to live very close to the ocean if in a low area, which is most of
Yeah.
Florida, in an area that gets hit by hurricanes a lot.
Yeah.
But I might live there because there are wonderful things in Florida,
It's
and
true.
people love people who live there. People who live in Louisiana. People, I
Yep.
guarantee, in the next couple of days, there are going to be interviews of people in Cameron Parish in Louisiana, Texas, who lived through Hurricane Laura, who may have lost half of their house or their entire house, and they are going to rebuild. They love their area.
Right.
They're attached to their area.
Yeah.
So,
Right.
me personally, I'd be a little nervous about living in an area where hurricanes hit so often, or even in California where there are earthquakes. But I think if there was a job there that I loved, or people there that I loved, and I
Mhm.
wanted to relocate, I think I would ultimately make the choice and just try to be smart about it and understand this is one of the risks that I've agreed to take on, and do everything I can to put myself in a position to survive whatever Mother Nature is going to throw
Right.
my way. I mean, there are risks everywhere. There are
It's
risks
true.
driving your car in Boston. I mean,
That's right. And hopefully the risks are, balanced with the joy of living someplace that feels
yeah.
like home. So, well, final question then for you, Eric. What are you working on now?
Oh, I am working on a book on privateering during the American
Ah,
Revolution, how privateers affected the course of the revolution. And there's a lot in there, obviously, on New England, but also on Pennsylvania and South Carolina and New York. It's just a fascinating story because it allows me to tell a tale of the American Revolution, which I think
yeah.
is endlessly fascinating, but also to put to rest some myths about privateers,
Uh-huh.
and I think give them their due as being part of one of many reasons why we ultimately won the American Revolution. I think what people often fail to realize, it was very touch and go, and there are so many points at which we could have and perhaps should have lost that war, because we benefited from decisions, the British decisions that were, in hindsight, not very smart. And we also benefited from some luck, but the privateers added to the tableau of the American Revolution, and just fascinating to me. And you're up in Newburyport, in that area. And Newburyport
Yeah.
was very, very active with the Tracy family
Yeah.
and others in privateering. Some great stories of another guy, privateer Captain Often Boardman. Just some great stories, and I'm having fun. I'm researching that right now. I mean,
Great.
this COVID situation has been, I work from home anyway,
Yeah.
so it hasn't changed that much.
Yeah.
It's changed other aspects of my life, but it's actually made researching a little bit more difficult because a lot of libraries that I normally use are closed.
Oh, that's
The
right.
Peabody Essex
Yeah.
Museum Phillips Library recently
Yeah.
opened, so I was able to do
Yeah.
a research trip there. But the number one library that I use to get a lot of very old documents and access a lot of databases is Harvard's Widener Library, and they're
Ah,
shut tighter than a drum.
yeah.
So I have a lot of materials. There's a lot of stuff online, and for whatever reason, the week before shutdown began, I spent 2 days at the Widener Library
Mm.
scanning hundreds of books and articles
Ah,
on privateering. So luckily I had them, and they're now on
that's
my
fortunate.
computer. But if I hadn't done that, I might not be able to make the deadline for my book, because there was so much material that I just can't get sitting here in my room.
Yeah. Well, that sounds like it's going to be a fascinating book, Eric. And so
Yeah.
consider yourself pre-invited to come back
Okay.
and share those stories. It was just a
Okay.
joy and an incredible learning experience to talk with you today. I really appreciate you coming on the morning show to teach us about hurricanes. The book is A Furious Sky, everybody. And the stories that Eric has shared with us today are just a small portion of the many, many stories in the book. Thank you, Eric, so much.
Thank you for
All
having me.
right. You
Appreciate
take care now. All right.
it.
Well, that's it for today's morning show, everybody. Thanks for watching. I hope you'll join us in 2 weeks for the morning show, when I'll be pleased to welcome Amy Wiedenstall. She's director of the Ipswich River Wildlife Sanctuary, part of Mass Audubon. And she'll be talking about the many changes happening at Mass Audubon, as well as research that she's conducted to help fine tune environmental education programs for children to help increase the odds that they will grow up to become active stewards of our precious and yet pretty vulnerable planet. And now a public service announcement from the Newburyport Choral Society. You're all welcome to join this fall because they'll be rehearsing virtually via Zoom. That's right, via Zoom, of course. From the safety and privacy of your home, you too can learn to sing from the experts, hear interesting lectures by prominent composers, and practice singing beautiful and inspiring music. For more information, visit www.newburyportchoralsociety.org, and you can learn all about it. Finally, I want to send a big shout out and a thank you and a farewell to our producer, Lily Doucette, who has been just an extraordinary and wonderful producer over the course of the summer. She's taking off for college, and we all wish her the best of luck with her new college adventure starting. So thank you and farewell, Lily. Appreciate your work over the summer so much. If you missed part of today's show, it'll be available for viewing on the Port Media YouTube channel. Playlist for the morning show. Go to www.ncmhub.org and click on the YouTube icon. Each show will also air on WJOP FM 96.3 on Friday at 8 a.m. and then again the following Tuesday at 4 p.m. and Wednesday at 3 p.m. and will also be available as a podcast on the SoundCloud. Click on www.ncmhub.org, click on the cloud icon, and then scroll down. Thanks so much for watching, everybody. See you in 2 weeks. Bye.